We're staying in our annotation.dwg file with our multi-line text and our single-line text. Now, in order to place that text, we created a text style. What we're going to look at now is creating a dimension style to place the other type of annotation, dimensions. Dimensions are fundamental to AutoCAD to allow you to communicate your design intent. So the idea being your dimensions would tell a manufacturer how big this bolting plate is and would also give him the diameter or radii of the holes in the plate as well. Now, in order to create a dimension style, you can do it from the Annotate tab here on the ribbon. And you can go to Dimensions here, click on the little sort of 45-degree arrow, and that opens up the Dimension Style Manager. I'll close that for the moment. I can also go back to the Home tab, go to the Annotation flyout, and select this icon here. That will also open up the Dimension Style Manager. Now, I'm going to work from the Annotate tab on the ribbon. Now, the reason I'm going to do that is because in the Dimensions panel, if I want to place any dimensions, I've got this fantastic Dimension Layer Override. So I can actually specify that I want all my dimensions to go on the Dimensions layer. It overrides the current drafting layer, which in the Home tab is the text layer. It's a very useful tool, so I always dimension from the Annotate tab on the ribbon. Now, in order to generate a dimension style, it's a little bit complex, and I just want to take you through that and create a very simple dimension style for you to use in the annotation.dwg file. So we'll click on the little 45-degree arrow, and that brings up our Dimension Style Manager. Now, we're not going to use any of the current default dimension styles. We're going to create our own. So we're going to click on New, and the new style name will be Training. Like so. We're going to start with ISO 25. The reason being is that is a metric dimension style, and we're using millimeters for this particular drawing. I am not going to make it annotative. We'll look at annotative scaling later, and we are going to use it for all dimensions. So I click on Continue. That'll bring up the new dimension style dialog box. Now, this is where we need to work through everything quickly, effectively, and simply to obviously give us a nice, simple, effective dimension style. So we're going to start with the Lines tab. Now, dimension lines are these lines underneath the dimension values in the preview. I always set everything to by layer, so it always adopts the properties of the dimensions layer. Baseline spacing, if I'm using millimeters, I'm going to make that say 10 millimeters, for example. Extension lines, again, set it all to by layer. So it's all adopting the dimensions layer properties, like so. Extend beyond dimension lines is this little extension here in the preview. I'm going to make that 2 millimeters, then press Tab. You'll see it get longer. And then the offset from origin is this little gap between the corners of the shape and the ends of these extension lines on the dimensions. I'm going to set that to 4 and press Tab, and you'll see that distance obviously get bigger. We don't need fixed length extension lines in this particular instance, so I'm going to go to the Symbols and Arrows tab. Now, you'll notice that there are lots of different types of arrowheads. Some of them can be ticks or obliques or open symbols or origin symbols and so on. Just stick with closed filled for now. And leader lines, sometimes I use a dot, a small dot. It's up to you, or you can use an open dot, perhaps like so. Arrow size, I'm going to increase that to say 3.5 millimeters in this case. You can use center marks for things like radii and diameters, or you can set it to none. I'm going to set it to none in this case. Dimension break, if you're breaking dimensions, 3.75 millimeters works. The arc length symbol is going to be preceding any dimension text. Radius jog dimension, well, if we're using any of those, I'll leave the jog angle at 45 degrees, and the linear jog dimension is 1.5 times the text height. That's all good. Let's go to the Text tab now. We're going to use the standard text style. That's the one that is already there, or we could use Training, and that would basically adopt to the Verdana Italic that we had going. It's entirely up to you which one you use. Text color, again, by layer. Now, you can have a fill color behind the text like that, or you can set it to none, which is what I do most of the time. Text height, I'm going to make that 3.5 millimeters in this case. When I hit Tab, you'll see that obviously gets bigger in the preview. Text placement is vertically above the the dimension line. Horizontally, it's centered on the dimension line. I could change that and have it over extension line 1 or something else, centered again like that. I can also put it centered in the dimension if I want to. Ideally, put it above. It tends to look neater. Offset from the dimension line, I normally have that about 1.5 millimeters. That's the text above the dimension line. So you'll see it's this distance here. Text alignment, you can have it all horizontal, you can have it all aligned with your dimension lines, or you can set it to the ISO standard where things like radii and diameters have this horizontal crank on the dimension. Personally, I prefer aligned with dimension line. In the Fit tab, all of this will leave as is. It's not annotative, so annotative is not ticked. We then go to the primary units. So these would be decimal. It's a metric drawing after all. And the precision there, you can set it to whatever precision you like. You can have no decimal places and it will round it to the nearest whole number, or you can have 1 decimal place perhaps, like so. I'm going to set it to 1 decimal place, and I'm going to set the decimal separator there to a period, full stop decimal place, like we would use normally in a metric drawing. Now, everything else here you don't need to worry about. Zero suppression trailing will round off the trailing zeros. So, for example, there you'll see that that is exactly 60 degrees, so it doesn't need the 0.0 after it. So it basically suppresses it, the trailing 0. Decimal degrees there, I would give that a precision of maybe 1 decimal place as well. And notice now, if I suppress that there, the trailing 0 is suppressed, as are the length dimensions as well. I can go to alternate units. I can display alternate units if I wish. So if I did that and set it to, say, architectural, you'll see there that it's now got the inches showing up next to the metric millimeters. I'm going to switch that off for now. And tolerances, if you had any cutting tolerances or tolerances for size, you could apply a different tolerance method. Let's say the limits method, for example, and you can see you've got different limits there if you need them. I'm going to set that to none as well and then click on OK. So we now have our training dimension style all set up. It's a very simple dimension style, and we're going to select it in the list, set it as the current style, and click on Close. You'll notice now that training up here in the dimensions panel in the Annotate tab is the current dimension style. If I go to the Home tab on the ribbon, click on the Annotation panel on the flyout, you'll see training is also the current dimension style there too. So you can see that training now is the current text style. It's also the current dimension style based on the dimension style we've just created.